Hello YouTube, it's Akrit again, back with another video from this new studio space of mine, and the first new piece of gear I want to take a look at here is this one, the Korg Drumlogue, a hybrid drum machine. Okay, so that's just one example of what this machine is able to do. Now it says hybrid drum machine, and that's because it's both analog and digital at the same time. So the kick drum, the snare drum, the low tom, and the high tom are all produced internally by the analog circuitry that's going on in here. And then we also have 6 different sample slots for samples, and the Drumlogue itself comes with a bunch of samples out of the box. But you're also able to import your own samples into this one using a USB cable to a computer, because this one doesn't have an SD card reader inside of it. And on top of all these different slots for drum sounds, we're also getting this multi-section over here with a synth, a noise generator, and another synth. And also a built-in delay, a reverb, and this master section over here. Now let's first of all go back and check out some of the analog drum sounds here, because analog circuitry in a drum machine like this, combined with samples, can actually become kind of cool. The analog kick drum, for instance, has a few parameters right here. We can change the decay, the tune, and the drive of the sound itself. Or we could also take this one step further and move into the menu for the kick drum and get access to even more parameters over there to shape the sound further. And something cool here is that we can actually add a transient to the analog kick drum, and that basically puts a short PCM sample in the front of the drum. That actually makes a big difference for the kick. Some of the settings we can access here is actually unique to the kick drum, but some of them are also the same across the board for the different analog sounds in here. That way we can tweak the pitch bend for the kick drum, the tone of the snappiness on the snare, and add distortion to the toms. Stuff like that. I think that the drive setting here, which is basically a distortion, makes a lot of sense for this kick drum, and it sounds really good. If you're doing that just right, with the right amount on the right kick drum in the right setting, things can actually become really cool. You know, a pure analog drum machine might feel a little bit limited to work with in the long run, because it just is what it is. But in this case, you're able to stack the analog sounds up with samples, and that really allows for a lot of flexibility in this one. And when it comes to these digital voices that basically plays back samples, we're also able to adjust a lot of the settings per individual sound. We can replace the sample entirely, change the tuning, the decay, the start and end point, add a filter or delay and reverb. So there are really no huge surprises here, but all of these settings are also pretty easy to access, and it doesn't take a lot of menu diving to get to this level of sound designing. We're going to talk about the sequencer in this one soon, but keep in mind that all of these different settings that I'm pointing out here can actually be automated and recorded as motion inside of the drum machine itself. Either per step on the sequencer like this, or actually by just tweaking it live and recording the automation like that. And that also applies to the setting where you can actually change the sample on an individual step. So if you want your open and closed hi-hat on the same part for some reason, that's doable too. Now the hardware itself here feels nice and sturdy. The knobs doesn't have too much resistance to them, and the plastic selector buttons down here makes a really satisfying click. They're not drum pads and they're not velocity sensitive or anything, so finger drumming is not really what this one is made for. This glossy metal faceplate looks cool, but picks up a lot of fingerprints. That's not uncommon for products like this, but it's still kind of worth mentioning. The display that shows all the different settings is easily readable and feels pretty snappy. I think the main mode here with the overview of the sequencer is really helpful, especially for step sequencing. Now the connections on the back of this one has a few cool things to offer. First of all, the 4 individual outputs is a really nice touch on a drum machine like this. We're able to assign different sounds to different outputs in the menu for multi-track recording or outboard processing of sounds, which is something a lot of people tend to do for the drums. We're also getting a stereo output, a headphone jack, an audio input, sync and MIDI in and out, a USB-B connection for connecting the Drumlogue to a computer, as well as a USB-A for hooking up something like a MIDI controller. Personally, I gotta say that I would have loved to see a USB-C connection on this one, both for MIDI and data transfer, but maybe also being able to power this one from USB. That would have been really cool. And of course, an SD card slot would also come in really handy for being able to transfer files. The USB cable and the computer kind of works, but it would have been easier to just be able to insert a normal SD card and read samples like that. But that's just me. Now the sequencer here is one of the Drumlogue's real strengths in my book. We're getting 16 steps over here and 4 bars right there, but we can also chain different patterns together and create longer sequences like that. We can get triggers into the sequencer by playing them manually, by hand, or by step sequencing them on the sequencer itself, and triggers can also be moved off the grid for an unquantized field, and we're also able to record stuff manually unquantized, which is always a good thing. The sequencer also has a bunch of different preset settings when it comes to the groove or the swing of the entire sequence. I'm not sure I've seen that before, and it comes in really handy with something like this. So a super straight pattern like this one can become something totally different by applying something like the Lo-Fi 2, and let's increase the amount of swing. Or decrease it to a negative value. And also settings that's basically common practice for most drum machines these days is available in this one. Stuff like ratcheting a sample more than once on a single step, or changing the probability setting, that's also available here, or being able to change the velocity of a single step. And that's where the graphics on the display comes in really handy, because it's really easy to navigate through your different settings like this. And this entire system also applies to the synths inside of this drum machine, so you can actually program synth lines and simple melodies in a similar way. First of all, let's add some steps into the sequencer like that. Let's move into the settings here and motion, hold that one, turn that one to a C, that one to a G, this one to maybe an A. Kinda cool. Sure, like programming the most intricate and complicated melodies becomes fiddly with the system, but I think it's kind of cool to at least get the option to do it, because at the end of the day, this is basically a drum machine, you know? But with that said, the different synth modes inside of this drum machine are actually pretty powerful. The VPM, variable phase modulation over here, has a few different presets to it, and also a bunch of settings for adjusting the phase modulation amount and frequency, as well as settings for the envelope and stuff like that. In the noise generator, we can change between a few different algorithms. Change the color of the sound, the peak, the attack, and release. Which makes it easier to add a little bit of a noise to your snare drum or your hand clap or something like that. Kinda cool. And the last of the multi-modes over here, called User, actually has a single preset right now called Nano, which has a bunch of different settings for that synthesizer as well. And as far as I've understood, we are supposed to be able to import our own synth engines inside of the unit itself and create our own synth engines. I haven't done that just yet, but I might get to that later, because that sounds kind of cool. And the Drumlogue also has a delay and a reverb inside of it, with all the different settings that you might expect from a delay and a reverb, and you're able to route the different sounds and samples through these effects before it goes to the master section, where we can also find a few more effects. Here we have a compressor, a filter, and a boost effect. That's basically adding saturation and loudness. And we also have a 3-band equalizer, which is nice to have. And finally, I think this is a pretty great little drum machine for what it is. Even though many of the presets and the demos and stuff seems to lean towards super up-tempo type of beats more than the stuff I normally make, I'm sure I'm gonna get a ton of usage out of this one in here. It's not too complicated to learn, it's actually kind of straightforward, and the combination between the analog and the digital voices and the engines inside of it really makes a lot of sense for a bunch of different types of music. And that's where my stuff comes into play. Normally I stack a bunch of different drum sounds on top of each other, and to be able to do something similar to that in a single drum machine makes a lot of sense for me. The drum samples that this one comes with are definitely usable straight out of the box as they are, but for someone like me, the really strong point here is that I'm able to import my own samples into this one and combine my samples with the analog voices from the Drumlogue itself, and add modulation and all that stuff that this one does really well. But nothing in the world is ever perfect, and the lack of a USB-C connection, an SD card reader, as well as maybe an internal battery or something like that, makes this one maybe not fit into everyone's workflow or setup. And even though a part of me really enjoys these super clicky buttons right there, another part of me feels like, yeah, velocity-sensitive pads is like the way to go for sequencing and recording drums, but I guess that could just be me, right? I'm sure a lot of people would use this one as a part of a live setup. This one could go really nicely together with a bunch of synthesizers for a standalone live gig or something like that. In my case, I'm gonna make sure to include this one in my synth setup somehow and be able to use this analog circuitry together with the digital stuff that it does really well too. And that's pretty much it for the Korg Drumlogue, this hybrid drum machine. Kinda cool. I kinda hate telling people this, but people say that it makes a difference, so subscribe, like, and comment. That would be appreciated. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope to see you guys in the next one. Until then, ha det gott!
Accurate beats.